Miss Marple's Unlit Hearth. The ashes held a burned secret. Chapter 1. The cold grates whisper. The train to Ashford Hollow rattled through the autumn dusk, its wheels humming a steady rhythm against the rails. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes tracing the blur of russet leaves beyond the glass. The invitation to visit her old friend, Mrs. Eleanor Price, had been a welcome excuse to escape the chill of St. Mary Mead. Yet, as the train slowed, a faint prickle of curiosity stirred within her. Eleanor's letter had mentioned a peculiar matter in the village. Though she'd been maddeningly vague about the details, Ashford Hollow was a speck of a place, nestled in a valley where the mist clung like a shawl. As Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, the air carried the crisp bite of October and the faint scent of wood smoke. Eleanor awaited her, bundled in a woolen coat, her face bright, but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Jane, you're a saint for coming," Eleanor said, linking arms as they walked toward the village. "It's been too quiet here since Widow Grayson passed, and yet there's something not quite right." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild, but her mind already turning. "Not quite right, you say? Do tell, Eleanor, and then sure," hesitated, glancing at the darkening cottages lining the lane. "It's the widow's cottage, the hearth, you see. It's cold, has been for years, they say. She never lit a fire, not once. But there are ashes in it, Jane. Fresh ashes, or so it seems." Miss Marple's needles paused in her lap, though her fingers remained poised. "Ashes without a fire? That is curious." The cottage in question stood at the edge of Ashford Hollow, its thatched roof sagging like a tired brow. Widow Grayson, Eleanor explained, had been a recluse, her days spent behind drawn curtains, her nights undisturbed by visitors. Her death 3 weeks prior, natural, the doctor had ruled, had stirred little fuss till the ashes were noticed by the village busybody, Mrs. Tuttle, who'd come to clear the cottage for sale. Eleanor led Miss Marple inside, the door creaking on its hinges. The air was stale, heavy with the must of disuse. The parlour was sparse. A faded armchair, a table with a single chipped teacup, and the hearth itself, a blackened moor in the stone wall. Miss Marple approached it, her eyes narrowing as she knelt, careful not to disturb the dust. The grate was indeed cold, its iron bars coated with a fine layer of soot. But there, in the centre, lay a small pile of ashes, grey, powdery, and oddly pristine, as though swept into place. Miss Marple reached for her spectacles, peering closer. A faint glitter caught her eye. A sliver of something metallic, half buried in the ash. "Eleanor," she said softly, "has anyone touched this hearth since Mrs. Tuttle's discovery?" "Not a soul," Eleanor replied, wringing her hands. "Mrs. Tuttle swears she only looked, though you know how she gossips. The whole village is talking now. Some say it's nothing, others think it's, well, unnatural." Miss Marple straightened, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Unnatural or not, ashes don't appear without cause. Tell me, what was Widow Grayson like? A solitary woman, you said, but was there anyone who might have reasons to visit her quietly?" Eleanor frowned, her voice dropping. She kept to herself. But there were whispers. A man was seen near the cottage once or twice, late at night. No one knows who. And then there's the matter of her family. Estranged, or so we thought. She never spoke of them, but she had a way of looking at that hearth, Jane, as if it held all her secrets. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the ashes, her mind sifting through the fragments of Eleanor's words. A hearth unlit, yet filled with ash, a widow with secrets, and a village humming with half-truths. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hid 1,000 calculations. "Well, Eleanor," she said, tucking her knitting into her bag, "I think I shall enjoy my stay in Ashford Hollow. There's nothing like a mystery to warm the heart, even if the hearth itself stays cold." As they left the cottage, the wind stirred, carrying the faint whisper of leaves, or perhaps something else, something that lingered in the shadows of the unlit grate. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter, already anticipating the secrets she would uncover, one ash at a time. Chapter 2. Embers of Gossip. The morning sun barely pierced the fog that draped Ashford Hollow, casting a muted glow over the village square. Miss Marple sat at a corner table in the Thistle tea-room, her knitting resting beside a steaming pot of Earl Grey. The tea-room was the heart of village gossip, its lace-curtained windows framing a parade of curious glances from passers-by. Eleanor had insisted she come here to take the pulse of Ashford Hollow, and Miss Marple was never one to decline such an opportunity. The room buzzed with low voices, the clink of teacups punctuating snippets of conversation. Mrs. Tuttle, the village's self-appointed chronicler, held court at a nearby table, her bonnet bobbing as she leaned toward two younger women. Miss Marple's ears, sharp as ever, caught the word ashes amid the chatter. She sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her attention razor-focused. "And I tell you, it's not natural," Mrs. Tuttle was saying, her voice carrying just enough to reach Miss Marple's table. "That hearth hasn't seen a flame in years, not since Widow Grayson took to her peculiar ways. Yet there they were, ashes as fresh as you please. I saw them myself." One of the women, a rosy-cheeked seamstress named Clara, leaned forward. "But what could it mean, Mrs. Tuttle? Surely it's just old ash, stirred up somehow." "Mrs." Tuttle huffed, adjusting her bonnet. "Old ash, my foot. There was something in it, something glinting, I swear. And don't forget the letter. I heard she burned a letter before she died, one she didn't want anyone to see." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking, a rhythmic counterpoint to her thoughts. A letter burned to ash? It was a tantalizing detail, though Mrs. Tuttle's penchant for embellishment was as well known as her scones. Still, gossip, like embers, often held a spark of truth beneath the flare. The tea-room door jingled, admitting a lanky young man with a nervous air. He scanned the room, then made his way to Mrs. Tuttle's table. Miss Marple recognized him from Eleanor's descriptions, Tom Weaver, the grocer's son, known for delivering Widow Grayson's meagre supplies. "Morning, Mrs. Tuttle," Tom said, his voice low. "Heard you were talking about the cottage. I might have seen something back before she passed." Mrs. Tuttle's eyes gleamed. "Go on, Tom. Don't keep us waiting." Tom shifted, glancing over his shoulder. "It was late, maybe a month ago. I was passing by the cottage on my way home, and I saw a shadow at her window. A man, I think, but it was dark. Couldn't see his face. Next morning, she looked different. Scared, maybe." Clara gasped, but Mrs. Tuttle pressed on. "A man? And you didn't think to tell anyone? Tom Weaver, what if he's the one who—" "Now, don't go spinning tales," Tom interrupted, his face reddening. "I'm only saying what I saw. Could have been nothing." Miss Marple set her cup down, her mind cataloguing the exchange. A shadow at the window, a frightened widow, and ashes that shouldn't exist. The pieces were scattered, but they were beginning to form a pattern, like the stitches in her knitting. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and approached the counter, where the tea-room's owner, Mrs. Lila Brent was arranging a tray of pastries. Lila was a quiet woman, her grey eyes observant, her words few but weighty. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Mrs. Brent, the tea is delightful," she began. "I couldn't help overhearing about Widow Grayson's cottage. It seems the whole village is quite taken with the mystery of those ashes." Lila's hands paused, her gaze meeting Miss Marple's. "They're a talkative lot, aren't they? Most of it's nonsense, but there's truth in some of it. The widow was private, but she wasn't always alone. I delivered her bread myself, and once I saw a letter on her table, addressed to someone called Harrow, I think. She snatched it away before I could see more." "Harrow," Miss Marple repeated softly, filing the name away. "And this was recent. A few weeks before she died," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked anxious that day, kept glancing at the hearth, as if it might speak. Miss Marple thanked her and returned to her table, her mind alight with possibilities. A letter to Harrow, a shadowy visitor, and a hearth that held more than it should. The tea-room's gossip had fanned the embers of the mystery, and Miss Marple knew she was close to uncovering the first true spark. As she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, Mrs. Tuttle's voice rose again, speculating about curses and ghosts. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Ghosts were all well and good, but the secrets of the living were far more dangerous, and far more likely to leave ashes in their wake. Chapter 3. The Scorched Envelope. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of Widow Grayson's cottage, casting long shadows across the parlour's bare floor. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, her eyes lingering on the pile of ashes that had so captivated Ashford Hollow. Eleanor had arranged for her to revisit the cottage, and now, with the village's gossip still ringing in her ears, Miss Marple was determined to find something tangible amid the whispers. She knelt carefully, her gloved hands hovering over the ashes. The metallic glint she'd noticed the previous day was still there, half buried. A tiny fragment that could be anything, a button, a clasp, or perhaps something more telling. She decided to leave it undisturbed for now, her instincts urging her to explore the cottage further before tampering with the hearth's secrets. "Eleanor," Miss Marple called softly, "might we look around the rest of the house? Mrs. Tuttle mentioned something about a letter, and I'd like to see if anything else was overlooked." Eleanor, who had been nervously straightening a crooked picture frame, nodded. "Of course, Jane, though I warn you, there's little here. The widow lived too simply, some say." They moved through the cottage, its rooms sparse and silent. The kitchen held a single saucepan and a chipped plate. The bedroom, a narrow cot, and a wardrobe with one faded dress. But in the corner of the parlour, near a rickety bookshelf, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail. A small rusted dustbin tucked beneath a side table, its contents spilling slightly onto the floor. She crouched, peering inside. Amid crumpled papers and vegetable peels lay a fragment of an envelope, its edges blackened and curled as if kissed by flame. Miss Marple retrieved it with care, holding it to the light. The paper was thick, the kind used for formal correspondence, but the fire had claimed most of it. Only a partial address remained, scrawled in a precise hand. E. Harrow. Our Miss Marple's breath caught. Harrow, the name Lila Brent had mentioned in the tea-room. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. She turned the fragment over, but the rest was illegible, the ink smeared and the paper brittle. Whoever had tried to burn this envelope had nearly succeeded, but their haste had left a clue behind. Eleanor, "Look at this," Miss Marple said, holding up the scorched remnant. "It seems someone was eager to destroy this. Do you recognize the name Harrow?" Eleanor frowned, stepping closer. "Harrow. It sounds familiar, but I can't place it. There's no one by that name in Ashford Hollow, I'm certain. Perhaps someone from her past? She never spoke of her life before she came here." Miss Marple tucked the envelope fragment into her handbag, her mind racing. A letter addressed to E. Harrow, partially burned, and ashes in a hearth that hadn't seen fire in years. The pieces suggested a deliberate act of concealment. But why? And by whom? She returned to the hearth, her gaze settling on the ashes once more. The metallic glint still teased her, but she resisted the urge to dig deeper just yet. Instead, she considered the envelope's implications. If Widow Grayson had written the letter, why burn it? If someone else had, how had it ended up in her cottage, and why destroy it here? Eleanor, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Who had access to this cottage after the widow's death? Mrs. Tuttle, of course, but anyone else? Eleanor hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. The vicar, Mr. Clement, came to bless the house, as is custom. And Tom Weaver dropped off a few things for the sale. Oh, and Mrs. Brent brought some bread for the workers sorting the place. But no one lingered Jane. At least, not that I know. Miss Marple nodded, her expression placid, but her thoughts anything but. The scorched envelope was a thread, fragile yet promising, leading to a truth someone had tried to burn away. She glanced at the hearth, its cold grate seeming to mock her with its silence. The ashes held the key, she was sure of it. But first, she needed to learn more about E. Harrow and the life Widow Grayson had left behind. As they left the cottage, the wind carried a chill that seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be uncovered. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter, her resolve as unyielding as the stone of the unlit hearth. The envelope was her first true clue, and she would follow it, no matter how deeply the truth had been buried. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Ash. The morning mist clung to Ashford Hollow, shrouding the village in a veil that muffled sound and softened edges. Miss Marple made her way to the small shop of Mr. Harold Finch, the local chemist, whose reputation for precision rivalled her own for observation. The scorched envelope and the mysterious ashes in Widow Grayson's hearth weighed on her mind, and she hoped Mr. Finch's expertise might shed light on the latter. The metallic glint and the oddly pristine pile of ash suggested something more than a simple fire, and Miss Marple was not one to let such details go unexamined. Mr. Finch's shop was a cramped affair, its shelves lined with jars of powders and vials of liquids, the air sharp with the tang of chemicals. The chemist himself, a wiry man with spectacles perched on a beak-like nose, looked up from his ledger as Miss Marple entered, her umbrella dripping from the damp. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," she said, her tone warm but purposeful. "I wonder if you might assist me with a small matter. It concerns some ashes found in Widow Grayson's cottage. Ashes that seem rather unusual." Mr. Finch's eyebrows rose, his curiosity piqued. "Ashes, you say? Unusual how, Miss Marple?" She produced a small paper packet from her handbag, carefully filled with a sample of the hearth's ashes she'd collected the previous day with Eleanor's permission. These were found in a hearth that hasn't been lit in years, or so the village believes. There's a metallic fragment within, and the ash itself seems too fine, too uniform. I'd be most grateful if you could tell me what they contain." Finch adjusted his spectacles and took the packet. his fingers deft as he sprinkled a pinch of ash onto a glass slide. He peered through a microscope, then conducted a series of tests, adding drops of reagents that fizzed and changed colour. Miss Marple watched patiently, her knitting needles idle in her lap, though her mind was anything but still. After a time, Mr. Finch straightened, his expression a mix of intrigue and caution. "This is no ordinary ash, Miss Marple. There's wood ash, yes, but also traces of paper. High-quality paper, like that used for legal documents or fine stationery. And there's something else. A chemical residue, likely potassium nitrate, often used in inks. Well, in things meant to burn quickly." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Things meant to burn quickly. Such as—" Mr. Finch hesitated, wiping his hands on his apron. "Could be a number of things. Certain types of treated paper, or even substances used to destroy evidence. The metallic fragment you mentioned. I'd need to see it, but it could be part of a seal, a clasp, or even a tool used to stir the fire." She nodded, filing away the information. Potassium nitrate, a component of gunpowder and other accelerants, suggested deliberate destruction, not a casual blaze. The presence of fine paper aligned with the scorched envelope addressed to E. Harrow, hinting that the hearth had been used to obliterate something specific, something someone desperately wanted gone. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful. Might I ask you to keep this between us? The village is already alight with rumours, and I'd rather not add fuel to the fire." He gave a curt nod, clearly pleased to be part of a mystery, however discreetly. "My lips are sealed, Miss Marple." As she stepped back into the mist, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the hearth's ashes, now more than a curiosity. They were evidence of a calculated act. The chemical residue pointed to intent, and the paper suggested a document, perhaps the very letter the envelope had once contained. But whose hand had set it alight, and why in a hearth that stood cold? She decided to revisit the cottage later, but first she needed to learn more about the widow's connections. The name E. Harrow lingered like a shadow, and the village's whispers of a mysterious visitor, Tom Weaver's shadowy figure at the window, could not be ignored. The ashes were speaking, their message obscured but growing clearer with each clue. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her steps brisk despite the damp. The hearth's shadows were lengthening, and she sensed they concealed a truth that would not stay buried much longer. For now, she would listen to the village's murmurs and let the ashes guide her to the next spark in the mystery. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Hesitation. The church of St. Agnes stood at the heart of Ashford Hollow, its weathered stone steeple piercing the grey afternoon sky. Miss Marple approached its oak doors, her umbrella tapping the cobbled path, her thoughts still swirling around the chemist's findings: potassium nitrate, fine paper, and the scorched envelope addressed to E. Harrow. The ashes in Widow Grayson's hearth were no accident, and Miss Marple suspected the village's vicar, Mr. Clement, might hold a piece of the puzzle. Eleanor had mentioned his visit to bless the cottage after the widow's death, and his name had surfaced in tea-room gossip, tinged with unease. Inside, the church was cool and dim, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and old hymnals. Mr. Clement was at the altar, arranging a modest bouquet of chrysanthemums. He was a slight man, his hair thinning, his movements deliberate but tinged with a nervous energy. He looked up as Miss Marple's footsteps echoed softly, his smile polite but guarded. "Miss Marple," he said, brushing his hands on his cassock, "Mrs. Price mentioned you'd be visiting. A pleasure to meet you, though I confess I'm surprised to see you here." Miss Marple returned the smile, her eyes gentle but probing. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Clement. I've been enjoying Ashford Hollow's charm, though I find myself intrigued by the late Widow Grayson's cottage. I understand you visited it after her passing. Such a curious matter. Those ashes in the hearth." The vicar's hands paused, his fingers lingering on the edge of the altar cloth. "Ashes? Oh, yes, the village is quite taken with that tale. I'm afraid I didn't notice anything unusual when I was there. My visit was brief. A simple blessing, nothing more." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unchanged, but her mind noting the slight tremor in his voice. "Of course, though I've heard the widow was a parishioner of yours. Did she ever confide in you, perhaps about her worries or her past?" Mr. Clement's gaze flickered to the stained-glass window behind the altar, where a shaft of light painted the floor in hues of blue and red. "Mrs. Grayson was private," he said carefully. "She attended services rarely, but she did come to me once, not long before her death. She spoke of a burden, a sin she called it, buried in flame. I urged her to unburden herself, but she refused, said it was too late." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested lightly in her hands, a prop that belied the sharpness of her attention. "A sin buried in flame," she repeated softly. "How poignant! Did she mention anyone else? A visitor, perhaps, or a name like Harrow?" The vicar's face paled, and he busied himself with the flowers, his fingers fumbling. "Harrow? No, she never mentioned such a name. As for visitors, I wouldn't know. She kept to herself, as I said." Miss Marple nodded, her silence inviting more. Mr. Clement cleared his throat, his voice strained. "If I may be frank, Miss Marple, I find this talk unsettling. The widow is gone, and stirring up her secrets does no one any good. Perhaps it's best to let the ashes lie." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her eyes catching the bead of sweat at his temple. "Though I find that secrets like ashes have a way of rising when disturbed." She thanked him and turned to leave, her steps slow as she passed the pews. The vicar's hesitation was palpable, his words too carefully chosen. A sin buried in flame, aligned too neatly with the scorched envelope and the chemical-laced ashes. Had Mr. Clement seen more in the cottage than he admitted? Or was he protecting someone or something else? Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking the village in a hush. Miss Marple paused by the churchyard gate, her thoughts turning to the hearth's metallic glint, still untouched. The vicar's unease was another thread in the tapestry, one that suggested he knew more than he dared say. She resolved to press further, perhaps by speaking to others who had crossed the widow's path. The name Harrow, the burned letter, and now a sin confessed but not revealed. The shadows in the ash were growing darker, and Miss Marple was determined to bring them into the light. Chapter 6. A Guest Unseen. The evening settled over Ashford Hollow, like a heavy quilt, the village's lanterns casting feeble pools of light against the gathering dark. Miss Marple sat in Eleanor's cosy parlour, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her hands, her mind sifting through the day's revelations. The vicar's halting words about a sin buried in flame echoed alongside the chemist's findings of potassium nitrate and fine paper in the ashes. The scorched envelope addressed to E. Harrow was a tantalizing clue, but the mention of a shadowy visitor, first raised by Tom Weaver in the tea-room, gnawed at her. She needed to know more about this unseen guest who had slipped through the widow's solitude. Eleanor, ever the gracious host, had invited Mrs. Dora Pike, a neighbour whose cottage faced Widow Grayson's, for an impromptu tea. Mrs. Pike was a wiry woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for noticing what others missed. As she settled into a chair, her hands smoothing her apron, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the mystery with her usual deftness. "Mrs. Pike," she began, her voice warm and unassuming, "Eleanor tells me you live just across from Widow Grayson's cottage. It must have been quiet, with her keeping so much to herself, though I've heard there may have been a visitor now and then. Someone seen at odd hours?" Mrs. Pike's eyes gleamed with the thrill of being consulted. "Oh, indeed, Miss Marple. I don't like to pry, mind you, but I've got a clear view of her gate from my kitchen window. About a month before she passed, I heard footsteps one night, crisp, like a man's boots on the gravel. It was near midnight, far too late for callers." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting needles still in her lap. "Footsteps, you say? Did you see anyone?" Mrs. Pike shook her head, her lips pursing. "Not clearly. The moon was thin and the mist was thick. But there was a shape, tall, moving quick-like towards the cottage. I thought I heard the door creak, but by the time I got to my window, they were gone. Next morning, I saw the widow at her gate, looking pale as a ghost. She didn't say a word when I waved." Eleanor gasped softly. "Dora, you never mentioned this. A stranger at midnight? It's positively chilling." "Not a stranger necessarily," Mrs. Pike said, lowering her voice. "I couldn't swear to it, but the way he moved, it put me in mind of someone local. Someone who knew the path well." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was alight. A local figure, familiar with the cottage's secluded lane, suggested someone from Ashford Hollow itself. Perhaps even someone she'd already encountered, like Tom Weaver or Mr. Clement. Or could it be another, yet unnamed, who had business with the widow under cover of night? "Did you notice anything else after that night?" Miss Marple asked. "Any changes in the widow's habits, or perhaps something at the cottage?" Mrs. Pike thought for a moment, her fingers tapping her teacup. "Now that you mention it, there was one thing. A day or two later, I saw smoke, not much, just a wisp, coming from her chimney. Odd, because everyone knows she never lit that hearth. I thought I'd imagined it, but now, with all this talk of ashes," Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. Smoke from a hearth that was supposedly never used. It aligned with the chemical residue Mr. Finch had found, suggesting a brief, purposeful fire, perhaps to burn the letter to E. Harrow, or something else entirely. The unseen guest and the ashes were linked, she was certain, but the nature of that link remained elusive. She thanked Mrs. Pike, her mind already mapping the next steps. The visitor's identity was key, and the faint smoke Mrs. Pike had seen was a clue that demanded closer scrutiny. Had the guest brought something to burn, or had the widow herself destroyed evidence after their visit? The hearth, cold and silent, was at the heart of it all. As Mrs. Pike took her leave, Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. "I think, my dear, we must revisit the cottage tomorrow. There's more to that hearth than we've uncovered, and I suspect our unseen guest left more than footsteps behind." Eleanor shivered, drawing her shawl closer. "Jane, you make it sound so ominous. Do you really think someone was there to do harm?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice was grave. "Harm, or perhaps to hide something. Either way, the ashes know, and I intend to make them speak." Outside, the night deepened. The village hushed but for the rustle of leaves. Somewhere, the unseen guest's shadow lingered, and Miss Marple felt the weight of their secret, as tangible as the cold grate in Widow Grayson's cottage. Chapter 7. The Charred Locket. The morning dawned grey and heavy, the air in Ashford Hollow thick with the promise of rain. Miss Marple returned to Widow Grayson's cottage, her umbrella at the ready, her mind sharpened by Mrs. Pike's tale of midnight footsteps and a wisp of smoke. The hearth's ashes, laced with chemical residue and fragments of fine paper, were no longer a mere curiosity, but a map to a hidden truth. Today she resolved to examine the metallic glint she'd glimpsed in the grate, hoping it might unravel another thread of the mystery surrounding E. Harrow and the unseen guest Eleanor. Accompanied her, though her steps were hesitant as they crossed the cottage's threshold. The parlour was as they'd left it, stark, silent, and dominated by the cold hearth. Miss Marple knelt beside the grate, her gloved hands careful as she sifted through the ashes with a small trowel borrowed from Eleanor's garden shed. The metallic glint caught the dim light, and with a gentle nudge she unearthed a small, blackened object no larger than a walnut. It was a locket, its surface scorched and warped, the delicate filigree barely discernible. Miss Marple held it to the window, her spectacles perched on her nose. The clasp was broken, but a faint inscription remained, etched into the back. To A, forever. Inside, where a portrait or keepsake might once have rested, there was only a residue of ash, as if its contents had been consumed by the same fire that had marred the locket's exterior. "Hey, Eleanor, look at this," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady, but her eyes alight with interest. "A locket, hidden in the ashes. It's been through a fire, but not entirely destroyed. I wonder who A might be." Eleanor peered over her shoulder, her face paling. "Good heavens, Jane, it's eerie! Do you think it belonged to the widow, or just someone else?" Miss Marple turned the locket in her fingers, noting its weight and craftsmanship. "It's too early to say, but its presence in the hearth suggests it was meant to be forgotten. Perhaps it belonged to the widow, or perhaps it was brought by her mysterious visitor. Either way, it's a clue we cannot ignore." She tucked the locket into a handkerchief and placed it in her handbag, her thoughts racing. The locket's inscription, "To A, forever," hinted at a personal connection, perhaps romantic or familial. Could A be linked to E. Harrow, or was it another figure from the widow's shadowed past? The ashes, with their traces of potassium nitrate and fine paper, suggested a deliberate act of destruction, and the locket's survival seemed almost defiant, a secret that refused to be burned away. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said, rising and brushing ash from her gloves, "I think it's time we spoke to someone who might know more about the widow's history. Is there anyone in the village who knew her before she became so reclusive? A friend, perhaps, or a relative?" Eleanor frowned, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. "There's old Mrs. Hawthorne, who lives near the mill. She's been in Ashford Hollow forever, and knew the widow when she first arrived some 30 years ago. They were close once, though I don't know if they stayed so. She's frail now, but her memory's sharp as a tack." Miss Marple nodded, her resolve firm. "Then Mrs. Hawthorne it is. A locket like this doesn't end up in a hearth by chance, and I suspect the widow's past holds the key to why it was there." As they left the cottage, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the thatched roof. Miss Marple glanced back at the hearth, its cold grate a silent witness to the secrets it had consumed. The charred locket was a tangible link to the widow's life, its inscription a whisper of love or loss. She felt the weight of the mystery deepen, but with it came a spark of anticipation. The ashes were yielding their truths, one fragment at a time, and Miss Marple was determined to follow where they led. The rain quickened as they walked toward the mill, and Miss Marple tightened her grip on her umbrella, her mind already framing the questions she would ask Mrs. Hawthorne. The locket, the envelope, the unseen guest, all were shadows in the ash, and she was closer than ever to bringing them into the light. Chapter 8. Flames of Memory. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time Miss Marple and Eleanor reached the mill, where Mrs. Hawthorne's cottage stood, its walls overgrown with ivy. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint tang of the river nearby. Miss Marple clutched her handbag, the charred locket tucked safely inside, its inscription, "To A Forever." A riddle that demanded context. Mrs. Hawthorne, Eleanor had said, was the village's living memory, and if anyone could shed light on Widow Grayson's past, it was she. Mrs. Hawthorne welcomed them into a parlour cluttered with faded photographs and knitted throws. She was a tiny woman, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes bright despite her years. A fire crackled in her hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold grate in Widow Grayson's cottage. Miss Marple settled into a worn armchair, her knitting bag at her side, her demeanour as unassuming as ever. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she began, her voice gentle, "I've been looking into the curious matter of Widow Grayson's cottage, particularly the ashes in her hearth. Eleanor tells me you knew her when she first came to Ashford Hollow. I wonder if you might share what you remember of her, her life, her connections." Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze sharpened, her hands folding in her lap. Mary Grayson, bless her soul. She wasn't always so shut away when she arrived. Oh, must be 30 years past. She was lively, full of spirit. Came from London, she said, after some trouble with her family. Never spoke much of it, but there was a sadness in her, like a flame gone dim. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. Trouble with her family? Did she ever mention names, or perhaps someone special to her? Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes drifted to the fire, her voice softening. There was a man once, before she came here. She never named him outright, but she wore a locket, silver, with fine work on it. Said it was a gift from someone she'd loved and lost. I saw it often in those early days, but later she stopped wearing it. Kept it hidden, I reckon. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene. The locket in her handbag, scorched and inscribed, matched the description too closely to be coincidence. "A locket?" she said thoughtfully. "Do you recall anything about this man, or why they parted?" Mrs. Hawthorne sighed, her fingers tracing the arm of her chair. "Only bits and pieces." Mary hinted at a quarrel. Something to do with her family's money. There was a brother, I think, who disapproved of the match. She said he vanished. Her love, that is, after a row with her kin. She came here to start fresh, but the past clung to her. Once, years later, she told me she'd burned something to keep it safe. I didn't understand, but her eyes were fierce, like she'd fought a battle, and won. Miss Marple's mind raced, weaving the threads together. A locket, a lost love, a family feud, and something burned. Perhaps the letter to E. Harrow, or another document tied to the ashes. The inscription "To A Forever" suggested the locket's recipient, but was A. Mary Grayson herself, or someone else. And could the brother or the lost lover be E. Harrow? Did she ever speak of anyone named Harrow? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual, but her eyes keen. Mrs. Hawthorne frowned, her brow creasing. Harrow? No, not that I recall. But there was a letter once, years back. I saw her writing it, late at night, by candlelight. She looked haunted, like she was arguing with a ghost. I asked who it was for, and she said someone who's gone, but not forgotten. I never saw her post it. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles untouched. The flames of memory were flickering now, illuminating a past marked by love, loss, and secrets. The locket, hidden in the ashes, was a relic of that past, and the hearth's chemical-laced remains suggested someone had tried to erase it. The unseen guest, the smoke Mrs. Pike had seen, the vicar's hesitation, all pointed to a truth that had been buried but not destroyed. She thanked Mrs. Hawthorne, her mind already plotting her next move. The locket's origins needed tracing, and the name E. Harrow demanded investigation. Perhaps the village records, or even a discreet inquiry in London, could uncover more. For now, the widow's past was coming into focus, its flames casting shadows that Miss Marple was determined to chase. As they stepped into the drizzle, Eleanor glanced at her friend. "Jane, you look as if you found something important. That locket, it's more than a trinket, isn't it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her umbrella shielding her from the rain. "Oh, yes, Eleanor. It's a key, and I suspect it unlocks a door someone thought was burned shut forever." The cottages. Cold hearth loomed in her thoughts, its ashes a silent witness to a love lost and a secret kept. Miss Marple tightened her grip on her handbag, ready to follow the flames of memory wherever they led. Chapter 9. The Cinders Cipher. The late afternoon light filtered through the grimy windows of Widow Grayson's cottage, casting a soft glow on the cold hearth that had become the heart of Miss Marple's investigation. Armed with Mrs. Hawthorne's revelations about the widow's lost love and a locket hidden away, Miss Marple returned to the parlour, her eyes fixed on the ashes. The charred locket, the scorched envelope, and the chemical residue all pointed to a deliberate act of concealment. But something about the ashes themselves nagged at her. A pattern, a purpose she hadn't yet deciphered. Eleanor stood by the door, her arms crossed against the chill of the unheated room. "Jane, you've been staring at that hearth for ages. What are you looking for now? Surely the locket was clue enough." Miss Marple smiled faintly, kneeling beside the grate with a small magnifying glass in hand. "Patience, Eleanor. Ashes can tell stories if you know how to read them. Look here, the way they're arranged, not scattered, but almost deliberate. It's as if someone left a message in the cinders." She studied the pile closely, her magnifying glass revealing subtle ridges and lines in the ash. The surface wasn't random. It bore faint traces of structure, like a drawing etched and then smudged. Using a pencil, she traced the outlines onto a scrap of paper, her movements precise. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a series of dashes and curves, suggestive of letters or symbols, though blurred by time or intent. "Eleanor, fetch me that broom handle, will you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but tinged with excitement. "I need to check something." Eleanor handed her the handle, watching as Miss Marple gently probed the hearth's edges. Near the back, where the grate met the stone, she felt a slight give. A panel, cleverly disguised by soot and age. With a soft click, it shifted, revealing a shallow compartment no larger than a cigar box. Inside was nothing but dust, but the compartment's existence was a revelation. "A hidden space," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes gleaming. "Hey, someone used this hearth not just to burn, but to hide. The ashes pattern, it's a cipher, or part of one, meant to point to this compartment. But whatever was hidden here is gone. Eleanor's eyes widened. A cipher! Jane, you make it sound like a spy novel. What could the widow have been hiding that needed such secrecy? Miss Marple straightened, brushing ash from her gloves. Something worth burning a letter for, and perhaps worth killing to keep secret. The locket, the envelope to E. Harrow, the chemical residue, all suggest a document or object of great importance. This cipher in the ashes was a final safeguard, a clue for someone trusted, or a taunt for someone feared. She studied her pencil sketch of the ash pattern, the dashes and curves teasing her memory. They resembled a shorthand code, or perhaps a personal script, but without more context. Deciphering it fully would take time. Still, the hidden compartment confirmed her suspicion. The hearth was more than a grave for secrets. It was a vault, and someone had emptied it before she arrived. "Eleanor?" Miss Marple said, tucking the sketch into her handbag alongside the locket. "We must learn more about who visited this cottage in the widow's final days. Mrs. Pike's unseen guest, Tom Weaver's shadowy figure. Someone knew about this compartment, and I suspect they took what was inside." Eleanor shivered, glancing at the hearth as if it might spring to life. "But who, Jane? The vicar? Tom? Or someone we haven't even considered?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the ashes, their cipher a silent challenge. "That's what we must find out. I think a visit to the village records might help. Births, deaths, marriages, anything that could link to E. Harrow or the widow's past. And we must keep an eye on those who seem overly interested in this cottage." As they left, the cottage seemed to exhale, its secrets clinging to the air. Miss Marple felt the weight of the cipher in her handbag, its meaning just out of reach. The locket's inscription, the envelope's address, and now the ashes' hidden message were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a truth someone had tried to burn away. She stepped into the drizzle, her resolve as unyielding as the stone of the hearth, knowing the cinder's cipher would lead her closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 10. Smoke and mirrors. The drizzle had ceased, leaving Ashford Hollow cloaked in a damp hush as Miss Marple made her way to the village hall, where the records of births, deaths, and marriages were kept. The cinder's cipher, sketched from the ashes of Widow Grayson's hearth, lay folded in her handbag alongside the charred locket and the scorched envelope fragment. The hidden compartment in the grate had deepened the mystery, suggesting a secret removed by an unseen hand. Perhaps the midnight visitor Mrs. Pike had heard, or the shadowy figure Tom Weaver had glimpsed. Miss Marple's instincts told her the key to E. Harrow and the widow's past lay in the village's archives. But a chance encounter shifted her focus. As she passed the village green, a man emerged from the mist, his coat collar turned up and his hat pulled low. He carried a battered suitcase, its corners worn, and his gait was hurried, almost furtive. Miss Marple recognized him from Eleanor's descriptions. Mr. Leonard Baxter, a travelling salesman who frequented Ashford Hollow, peddling everything from tonics to trinkets. His name had surfaced in tea-room gossip, linked to vague rumours of dealings beyond his wares. She slowed her steps, her expression benign, but her eyes sharp. "Good morning, Mr. Baxter," she called, her voice carrying just enough to halt him. "A damp day for travel, isn't it?" He stopped, his shoulders tensing before he turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Marple, is it?" "Aye, damp indeed. Just passing through, as always. Got business in the next town." Miss Marple tilted her head. her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. "Of course, though I've heard you were acquainted with Widow Grayson. A curious matter, her cottage, those ashes in the hearth, have the village quite stirred. Did you ever notice anything odd when you called on her?" Baxter's smile faltered, his fingers tightening on his suitcase. "The widow barely knew her. Dropped off a bottle of liniment now and then, that's all. Never saw her hearth. Too busy to linger, you know." His words were quick, too quick, and Miss Marple noted the bead of sweat at his temple despite. "The chill, naturally," she said, her tone mild. "Though I understand she had a visitor near the end. Perhaps someone delivering more than liniment. The ashes contained traces of chemicals, you see. Potassium nitrate, the sort used in certain preparations." Baxter's eyes flickered, and he shifted his weight, as if poised to flee. "Chemicals? Can't say I know anything about that. I sell honest goods, Miss Marple, nothing fancy. If you'll excuse me, I've a train to catch." Tipped his hat and hurried off, his suitcase bumping against his leg. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his unease. Potassium nitrate, Mr. Finch had said, could be used in inks or accelerants, substances a salesman might procure if his trade extended beyond the ordinary. Baxter's evasive answers and hasty retreat marked him as a figure worth watching, a possible link to the hearth's secrets. She continued to the village hall, where the clerk, a bespectacled young woman named Miss Ellis, allowed her to peruse the records. Miss Marple searched for any mention of E. Harrow or Mary Grayson, but the ledgers yielded little. The widow's arrival in Ashford Hollow 30 years prior, unmarried, with no listed kin. Harrow appeared nowhere, though a faded entry noted a marriage licence for a Mary Alton and an Edward Harrow in a neighbouring parish, dated a year before the widow's arrival. The connection was tenuous, but Miss Marple tucked it away, her thoughts returning to Baxter. Had he been the unseen guest, bringing chemicals to burn a document, or the locket's contents in the widow's hearth? His nervous demeanour suggested guilt, or at least knowledge, and his trade gave him access to substances like potassium nitrate. The cipher in the ashes, the hidden compartment, and the locket's inscription all pointed to a secret someone had tried to erase, and Baxter's shadow loomed larger in that puzzle. As she left the hall, the mist parted briefly, revealing the distant outline of the widow's cottage. Miss Marple paused, her umbrella tapping the ground. Baxter's smoke and mirrors wouldn't deter her. The truth was close, hidden in the interplay of ashes and alibis. She resolved to keep an eye on him, perhaps through Eleanor's network of village eyes, while pursuing the Harrow lead. The hearth's secrets were unravelling, and Miss Marple was determined to see through the haze to the flame beneath. Chapter 11. The Hearth's Last Secret. The twilight cast long shadows over Ashford Hollow, as Miss Marple gathered a small group in the village hall, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of anticipation. The mystery of Widow Grayson's hearth had woven a tight web, ashes laced with potassium nitrate, a scorched envelope addressed to E. Harrow, a charred locket inscribed to A forever, and a cipher in the cinders pointing to a hidden compartment. Leonard Baxter's nervous deflection had sharpened her suspicions, but the threads of the unseen guest, the vicar's hesitation, and the widow's past demanded a reckoning. Tonight she would stir the ashes one last time. Eleanor had rallied the key figures: Mr. Clement, the vicar; Mrs. Pike, the sharp-eyed neighbour; Tom Weaver, the grocer's son; Mrs. Tuttle, the gossip; and, to Miss Marple's quiet satisfaction, Leonard Baxter, who'd been persuaded to delay his departure. They sat in a semicircle, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease, the hall's single lamp casting flickering light. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but commanding attention. "The ashes in Widow Grayson's hearth have puzzled us all, but they are more than a curiosity. They are evidence of a secret someone tried to burn away. Tonight, I propose we piece together the night of the unseen guest, for I believe the hearth's last secret lies there." She held up the charred locket, its blackened surface glinting in the lamplight. "This was found in the ashes, inscribed to A forever. Mrs. Hawthorne told me the widow once wore such a locket, a gift from a lost love. The records suggest a connection to an Edward Harrow, perhaps her betrothed before she came to Ashford Hollow. But why was it burned, and by whom?" Mrs. Pike shifted, her eyes darting. "I told you about the footsteps that night, Miss Marple. A man, I'm sure, at her gate near midnight. And the smoke I saw days later. Could it be when the locket was burned?" Miss Marple nodded, turning to Tom Weaver. "Tom, you saw a shadow at her window a month before her death. Did it resemble anyone here?" Tom flushed, his gaze flickering to Baxter, then away. "It was dark, ma'am. Could have been anyone tall, I suppose. I didn't think much of it then." Baxter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His suitcase, at his feet like a shield. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him before moving to Mr. Clement. "Vicar, you spoke of the widow's confession, a sin buried in flame. Did she mention a locket, or perhaps a visitor who brought trouble?" Mr. Clement's hands clasped tightly, his voice low. "She was vague, Miss Marple. Only said she'd done wrong and burned something to protect someone. I thought it was guilt, not this." Miss Marple set the locket down and produced her sketch of the cinder's cipher. This pattern in the ashes led to a hidden compartment in the hearth, now empty. I believe it held a document, perhaps a letter to E. Harrow, or proof of the widow's past. The ashes contained potassium nitrate, a chemical to ensure a quick burn. And Mr. Baxter, you deal in such substances, do you not?" Baxter lurched forward, his voice sharp. "Now see here, I sell liniments, not chemicals for scheming. I barely knew the widow. Yet you were seen near her cottage," Miss Marple said smoothly, "by a witness who prefers anonymity. And your haste to leave suggests you know more than you've shared." The room tensed, eyes darting between Baxter and Miss Marple. Then Mrs. Tuttle, unable to resist, blurted, "I saw him too, skulking by the lane one evening, weeks back. Looked guilty as sin." Baxter's face drained of colour. "All right," he muttered, slumping. "I was there, but not for what you think. The widow asked me to get her something. Salts, she said, for cleaning. I didn't ask why. She paid well, and I delivered. That's all." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was relentless. "Salts or potassium nitrate? Did you see her burn anything, or leave anything in the hearth?" Baxter shook his head, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Miss Marple turned to the group, her voice steady. "The locket's owner was the widow's love, Edward Harrow. She fled a family feud, keeping his gift until fear, or betrayal, drove her to burn it. The cipher was her final act, pointing to a truth someone took from the compartment, that someone was her visitor, and I believe it was you, Mr. Clement." The vicar gasped, his hands trembling. "Me? Miss Marple, I only blessed the house." You blessed it and you lingered, she said gently. Your hesitation, your knowledge of her sin. It was you she trusted to hide her secret. What did you take from the compartment? Tears welled in Mr. Clement's eyes. A letter, he whispered. She confessed to me. She'd written to Edward Harrow, begging him to return, revealing a child they'd had, given up years ago. She burned the locket to sever the past. But the letter, I took it to protect her memory. It's hidden in the church. The room fell silent, the hearth's last secret laid bare. Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. The locket's ashes had spoken, and the truth, though painful, was free. Chapter 12. Ashes to Truth. The village hall was hushed, the lamplight flickering as Mr. Clement's confession hung in the air. The revelation of a letter hidden in the church, penned by Widow Grayson to Edward Harrow about a child given up long ago, had unravelled the hearth's final secret. Miss Marple stood calmly, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes gentle but unyielding as she faced the vicar. The charred locket, the scorched envelope, the cindered cipher, all had led to this moment where the ashes would yield their truth. Mr. Clement, Miss Marple said softly, you've carried a heavy burden. The letter you took from the hearth's hidden compartment, why did you feel it needed protecting even after her death? The vicar's shoulders sagged, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary, Widow Grayson, told me the child was alive somewhere, and that the letter could ruin lives if it fell into the wrong hands. Her family had forced her to give up the babe, and Edward Harrow, her love, had vanished after their parting. She feared the truth would shame the child or stir old vendettas. I couldn't let her memory be tarnished. Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final threads. The locket inscribed "To A Forever" had been a token of Mary's love for Edward, perhaps the A standing for Alton, her maiden name or another endearment. The envelope addressed to E. Harrow had likely been a draft or a decoy, burned to mislead, while the true letter was hidden. The potassium nitrate in the ashes, supplied unwittingly by Leonard Baxter, ensured the locket and other traces were reduced to cinders, and the cipher in the ash was Mary's last act to guide a trusted soul, Mr. Clement, to the letter's hiding place. She turned to the group, her voice steady. The hearth's ashes held more than a secret. They held a mother's love and regret. Mrs. Pike's footsteps, Tom's shadow, Baxter's chemicals, all were fragments of a night when Mary Grayson tried to bury her past. But the truth, like ash, rises when stirred. Mr. Clement, will you show us the letter? The vicar hesitated, then nodded, his face etched with resolve. The group followed him to St. Agnes's Church, the night air sharp and still. Inside, Mr. Clement knelt behind the altar, retrieving a small tin box from a recess in the stone. He opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper, its edges yellowed but intact, addressed to my dearest Edward. Miss Marple read silently, her heart heavy. The letter spoke of a daughter, born in secret and given to a distant family, of Mary's guilt and her hope that Edward might find their child. It named no one living, only a wish for forgiveness. The locket, Mary wrote, was to be burned, a final severing of their bond to protect the child's future. Mrs. Tuttle sniffled, breaking the silence. Oh, poor soul! All that pain hidden in her hearth. Baxter, his earlier defensiveness gone, muttered, "I didn't know what the salts were for. She never said." Miss Marple folded the letter, handing it back to Mr. Clement. "This belongs in safe hands, perhaps with the child, if she can be found. The widow's secret is no longer a threat, but a legacy of love." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the church, her gaze on the altar's candlelight. The cost of truth had been high. Mary's solitude, the vicar's guilt, the village's unease. Yet the ashes had spoken, their cipher and clues leading to a resolution that honoured the widow's memory. The hearth's fire, though unlit, had burned brightly in its own way, illuminating a past that could now rest. Outside, Eleanor joined her, her voice soft. "Jane, you've done it again. But what happens now? The letter, the child." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes distant. "We leave that to kinder hands, Eleanor. The truth is free, and sometimes that's enough." The church bells tolled, a solemn note in the night. Miss Marple stepped into the dark. The ashes' truth settled, but her mind already alert for the next mystery waiting in the shadows of Ashford Hollow. Chapter 13. The Hearth Rekindled. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Ashford Hollow, bathing the village in a tentative warmth that felt like a promise of renewal. Miss Marple stood outside Widow Grayson's cottage, her umbrella folded, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The mystery of the unlit hearth had been laid bare. A charred locket, a scorched envelope, a cipher in the ashes, and a letter revealing a child born of love and loss. Mr. Clement's confession and the letter's discovery had quieted the village's whispers, replacing gossip with a sombre understanding of Mary Grayson's hidden pain. Eleanor joined her, her face reflecting a mix of relief and melancholy. "Jane, you've worked a miracle here. The village feels lighter somehow. But what will become of the cottage now? And the letter?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the cottage's sagging roof, its windows no longer ominous, but merely tired. "The letter is with Mr. Clement, who will seek the child discreetly, if she wishes to be found. As for the cottage, I suspect it will find new life. Secrets once aired have a way of making room for hope." As if in answer, a young couple approached from the lane, their voices bright with plans. They were the new buyers, Eleanor explained, eager to restore the cottage. The woman, a schoolteacher named Clara, paused to greet them, her eyes drawn to the hearth visible through the open door. "I heard about the ashes," Clara said, her tone curious but kind. "Such a strange story. We're going to light the hearth properly, make it a home again." Miss Marple smiled, her heart warmed by the thought. "A fine idea, my dear. A hearth is meant to hold warmth, not secrets." The couple moved inside, and Miss Marple watched as Clara knelt by the grate, sweeping away the last of the ashes with a broom. The act felt symbolic, a cleansing of the past. The locket, now in Mr. Clement's care alongside the letter, would serve as a keepsake for the child, should she ever claim it. The envelope to E. Harrow, the potassium nitrate, the cipher, all had been steps to this moment, where the hearth could be rekindled. Eleanor linked arms with Miss Marple as they walked back toward the village. "You've a gift, Jane, for seeing what's hidden. I suppose you'll be off to St. Mary Mead soon." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was thoughtful. "Soon, Eleanor, but not quite yet. Ashford Hollow has a way of keeping one's curiosity alive. I've a feeling there are other stories here, waiting to be told." They passed the church, where Mr. Clement was tending the garden, his face less burdened than before. Mrs. Pike waved from her window, and even Mrs. Tuttle, bustling toward the tea-room, offered a nod rather than a rumour. Leonard Baxter had left on the morning train, his role in the mystery reduced to an unwitting supplier, his conscience lighter for it. The village was healing, its shadows softened by the light of truth. As they reached Eleanor's cottage, Miss Marple paused, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The hearth's ashes had told their story, a tale of love, sacrifice, and redemption. Yet she knew the world was full of unlit hearths, each with secrets of its own. For now, she would savour this resolution, the warmth of a mystery solved, and the quiet promise of new beginnings. Inside Eleanor's parlour, a fire crackled merrily, its flames a mirror to the rekindled spirit of Ashford Hollow. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mind already turning to the next whisper of intrigue that might call her from the fireside. And somewhere, in the heart of the village, a new flame flickered in Widow Grayson's hearth, banishing the cold and carrying her memory forward, not as a secret, but as a spark of hope.